Okay, well, I just want to welcome you all. Are we recording? Yes, we're recording. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank the Northeast Media Literacy Conference for this opportunity to discuss the digital divide for today's town hall. I am Pamela Pereira. I'm founder and director of Media Savvy Citizens. We work to facilitate the understanding, positive participation, and meaningful media interaction for New Mexico learners. I am also the chair of New Mexico Media Literacy Now, working for advocating media literacy initiatives. And it seemed fitting to have this conversation at this time. We just came off Media Savvy Citizens came off a media fluency professional development pilot with 30 New Mexico school districts last spring. And they were transitioning into remote and digital schooling. We heard a lot of teacher stories centered around issues of access and issues of equity. And we could see the haves and have-nots, and all the different layers of at least in our state, how the digital divide lays out. And we want to discuss like what it looks like nationally from different aspects. We want to know how it affects our communities, the complexities of the digital divide. We also want to explore some solutions to leave you with hope and different things that you can do in your communities to implement. So as you all know, media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act with all communications. And if we don't have access, they are closely connected, access and the digital divide, right? So it means different things, this digital divide. We know today there are growing concerns across not just the United States, but across the world. And what that lack of access is doing, how it's affecting people, the access to what? To internet and devices, or access to knowledge, or access to skills, right? So we cannot introduce certain media literacy concepts digitally if we don't have that access, since most of our since we're all mostly on digital devices now, right? So joining us today is an amazing group of people representing knowledge at the education, policy, innovation, rural, and urban levels. They will shed light on how the digital divide functions, whom it impacts, and we will get a big picture and we will hear stories. So our first presenter today is Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. She is the director of the Brookings Institution Center for Technology Innovation. She is a senior fellow in governance studies and serves as the co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank, both at the Brookings Institution. Her research focuses on public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology. She is an expert on broadband deployment, internet governance, and the intersection of race, wealth, and technology within the context of civic engagement and economic development. She's written extensively on the digital divide in both urban and rural areas. I just came up with a new name, urban and rural areas. And she has a forthcoming book on the topic, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. This book is due to come out in 2021. Dr. Turner-Lee currently serves on the Federal Communications Commission. She serves on different working groups, the broadband and the digital diversity working groups. Welcome, Dr. Turner-Lee. Please define the digital divide for us and tell us who is impacted and how we see that digital divide.
Well, thank you, Pamela. Thank you for that long introduction. Sometimes I think when I'm sitting at home under my Zoom light and camera that the days have become nights and the nights become weekends. So I think in the future, we can just say that we are all here, right? And particularly as we wait upon these election results. I could not be more humbled to speak before this group, because I consider myself to be somebody who started in this space before I went to Brookings as a digital evangelist. Back in the early 2000s, when my dear friend Larry Irvin worked with Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown and came out with BK Fulton, this interesting dialogue around the US digital divide, I was hooked. And I was hooked for a variety of reasons. I was finishing my PhD in Chicago at Northwestern, and I was volunteering at a 10 workstation lab, which is in the middle of the south side of Chicago in the Robert Taylor homes. If you know anything about the Robert Taylor homes in the city of Chicago, there was stacked up housing that created very uncomfortable and disturbing situations and circumstances for low-income people. But there was hope in this small computer lab of 386 computers and CD-ROMs. Yes, I am dating myself, as well as the T1 and line that actually defined, I think, for them a way out of some of those circumstances. And here we are, where the digital divide originally started as a concept that was quite binary, defined by the haves and the have-nots, who had broadband, who didn't, who had a device, who didn't, who had digital literacy, who didn't, who had access to a computer lab when those were actually famous. In fact, I started in that movement in terms of the Community Technology Center movement. That was then, and as that great book that we all read in high school said, this is now. And the this is now, it's even more complicated. You know, what started out as having digital access as more of a something to do, it wasn't necessarily a privilege. I was a graduate student. I didn't have a phone. I had a little small beeper that you put in numbers on. There was no phone to call. You had to go to a pay phone. There was not anything electronic. It was a rotary, or it was something that was just so different from today. But you fast forward 10 to 12 years later, and guess what? We now see a more complicated and much more layered internet. One that requires you to have financial collateral or a credit card if you want to get a ride sharing service. One that says that you have to not only have the connection, but you have to have the device to be able to fully function in this new digital economy. One that now really encourages us from moving from inline to online for government services as well as other systems. And to me, and this is why my book is called Digitally Invisible, it is created what Michael Harrington talked about with the war on poverty, this other America, this America that we know very little about. And one of the things that I did in my book right before the pandemic hit was to go out across the country to 7 cities and just ask people about their internet access. As a sociologist, it was the most fantastic anthropological experience that I've had in many years, being a person who sits confined in the Beltway. But it actually showed me from rural America to urban America, from north to south, small city to large city, small place where there were more cows than people. I'm a city girl. I was a little concerned when I made a wrong turn almost to where those cows were. It showed me how important digital access is. And fast forward to today, we now have within the last 7 months a pandemic where social distancing is now the norm. It's not the exception. And people have had to rely upon digital access, not just to do the things that we used to do, get a movie, figure out what's going on in terms of airline tickets and train tickets, but it is the only vehicle to be able to get access to food, to get access to unemployment insurance, to learn, to live and communicate with family members. And so I'm so happy you're having this conversation, because if we were to have this conversation prior to the pandemic, we would have said in the case of rural that the digital divide was just about, as my colleague says, red states and people who live in particular communities and topographies. But the digital divide is national. It's universal. It's actually global. And in this country, what is so disturbing about it is that we've known about it before the pandemic. 18 million people at the last count are offline. This number is set to be even higher as economic vulnerability set in, where people are being evicted, they cannot pay basic bills, and they are choosing between broadband and bread. The people who are sitting on the wrong side of digital opportunity today, they're disproportionately people of color, they're rural Americans largely, they're people who are English learners, they're older Americans over 80, they're people with disabilities. And there's this new realm of folks that I call in my book the new underclass. They are farmers, they are day laborers, they are people who without access cannot get the next job, cannot get to the next doctor appointment in the age of COVID. And so I think as we talk about what this looks like in terms of the rural communities, I'm working on a project right now to sort of unpack not just the challenges of infrastructure. A couple of stories that I've done in the last few years have been moving this conversation from a policy perspective, from rural divides to rural solutions. Because guess what? People in urban areas have challenges with competition and price. So this is not necessarily just one segmented, fragmented problem. This is a universal problem in terms of the social contract that the United States has in ensuring people access. And so the particular challenge that we have in rural, and I know that from driving 2 to 3 hours outside of DC, is the fact that people live in places where middle mile or last mile challenges exist. But more so than that, we have rural places where people have been on the outskirts of opportunity, economic, politically, educationally, and the only way out is through broadband. Give you a quick story and then I'm gonna shut up, because I'm like a Black Baptist preacher. I can keep going, but I know we got a big battle that we have to do. When I think about the last visit I made before the pandemic, I went to 2 places. I went to Garrett County, Maryland, Stanton, Virginia, and I visited a highly Latino community out of West Phoenix. It's sort of outskirts where Phoenix becomes rural. If you ever drive there, where Sedona begins to start. And there was a couple of phenomena that I realized before the pandemic that we need to pay attention to. In Garrett County, mechanic told me, because they had actually deployed what was called TV white space. So they had very limited mesh network, but this mechanic, who was the only mechanic in town, who took hours to find a part via books, said because of that little bit of internet, it was like going to the ice cream truck. I could pick at least one flavor, get online and order equipment and have the productivity that I needed to service the customers of Garrett County. In West Phoenix, Arizona, really towards the outskirts when you start making it up to the mountains of Sedona, the kids there were Latina students who were primarily the children of undocumented immigrants. They all had cell phones, 100%, because they were fearful of the fact that those cell phones would be the only way to find out if a parent was deported on the outskirts of Maricopa County. Never seen anything like that before. The kids walked around 3, 4, 5 years old with cell phones. Just that was the only way of communication. And then in Garrett County, where the Amish are primarily the dominant folks there, they relied upon a 5-room schoolhouse, or Stanton, let me go there. Stanton, on the other side of the railroad tracks, there was a family called the Mulgrave family, with a young African-American male relied upon his cell phone for day labor work. And every time halfway through the month, he actually lost minutes. And he would literally either have to go to his girlfriend's house to jump on her mother's Wi-Fi, or he'd have to figure out how to wait it out until he was able to refresh his service. These are the stories of not just broadband. These are the faces of the digital divide that suggest as a policymaker, as we have this conversation, that we need to do more to, one, humanize the condition of rural Americans that have been left out of the large mainstream activities that we have, first and foremost. 2, that we need to understand when we speak rural, we're not just talking about white rural Americans, folks. We're talking about tribal lands. We're talking about the Black Mississippi Delta. We're talking about white folks that sit out in the outskirts of Garrett County where the social service agencies can't even go there because it takes 2 hours to give somebody a service, 2 hours to put it in the system, and 2 hours to go back. Garrett County has one of the highest rates of opioid addiction. And I learned these stories again from going out there. And 3, we needed to find that universal service is not just about a territory, but it's again about the social contract the United States has with its citizens. As we get through this pandemic, digital is the new normal. It's not going away. 100,000 businesses have closed. In fact, what's so sad, the businesses that I visited in Stanton, Virginia, and Garrett County, many of them have already closed in the course of 7 months. And so what that suggests is that this type of robust discussion that we're having now require us, particularly for our young people, to get this right. Or else I'm gonna be back here still looking the same, because I don't age, talking about the very same issue of why we have not closed the digital divide in the last 2 decades. So I'll stop right there because I want to hear from what everybody else, but I'm privileged, Pamela, to be here. Pamela found me and just was like, you got to be on this panel, girl. You have to. And I said yes, in spite of the fact that I'm trying to figure out who won the election, but I'm so glad to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us and shedding light on all the complexities of the digital divide and who gets impacted and who, and how it impacts our people. We heard about people today. So thank you. So next up is going to be Dr. Alan Pratt, who is here today as the Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association. He is interested in issues that impact rural schools and the role of instructional leaders at the district and building levels. He's also involved at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga School of Education and Educational Leadership. He has been a teacher, coach, principal, assistant, superintendent, curriculum director, executive director of the Tennessee Rural Education Association, executive director of the East Tennessee Center for Regional Excellence for the Tennessee Department of Education, and rural outreach liaison for Lincoln Memorial University. Welcome. We would love to hear from you about the current state in rural America in regards to the digital divide. Give us the broad ideas that you're hearing about, you're seeing in education. Welcome, Dr. Pratt.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. And first, I'd like to say to Dr. Turner-Lee, I've been to the places she's been to, visited and walked in the same steps. And since you are got the Southern Baptist kind of preacher mode going, I grew up in that world as well, so I feel your pain. You got what I'm saying. But I also, I want to say amen. What you said was directly on. Urban and rural have many of the same issues when you're dealing with this broadband or connectivity issue. And I'm gonna give you, prior to COVID, NREA, our work was around teacher shortage, broadband connectivity, and funding resources for rural America. During COVID, and I promise you after COVID, ours will be teacher shortages, broadband connectivity issues, and funding issues for rural America. And it's kind of sad in the sense of what we've seen, but on the positive note, we've seen major innovation, major steps toward kind of fixing some problems in the short term to make sure some of our students are connected. What we saw from pretty much March until now, we're seeing a lot of hotspots, Wi-Fi hotspots, connectivity band-aids is what we call them, where students can come to certain areas, libraries or schools to get the Wi-Fi access to download assignments or work on assignments. We've also seen programs and innovative work out in Virginia, where there's a program called Wireless on Wheels, where they made a solar hotspots. I think they have 31 of those across the county, and I'll put the link in when I'm finished in the chat so you can search. We started a program called I Am a Rural Teacher with the funding of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with the Rural Schools Collaborative. And we started prior to COVID. We were going to tell stories about why it's important to be a rural teacher. As COVID hit, we shift to stories about of inspiration and stories of what's happening and how they're impacting or how they're helping their communities. And what was amazing was the effort. Number one, when we started in March, was the effort of teachers and frontline workers and our stakeholders in our rural schools just to feed our students, to make sure they had access to that component. And then it went to the phase of how do we make sure we're providing a quality education for the students that we serve. And what we're seeing as we move through the summer and into the fall is really a hybrid approach where we see districts trying to go face-to-face and trying to do the best they can to meet the needs, but also providing 100% virtual to a section of their students. I'm going to put this in perspective because I don't know if everyone understands this, and I'll take from my standpoint, from my background. When schools would go one-to-one, adopt a learning management system, adopt an online virtual platform, it would take a year, sometimes 6 months to a year for them to plan and move this. A lot of our rural districts did it in 13 days. It's amazing. Now, let's take the positive of that. The positive is we know we're flexible. We can move around and we can do some things that we never thought we could do before. That's a positive. The negative, all of our decisions were not great during that time period. We know, and I think that adjustment as we're moving forward, we're still working on those. What's coming out of this and what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a pause in some face-to-face instruction, and we're seeing a more back to the virtual, 100% virtual, but we're also seeing these creative, what I call 2 or 3 day windows where students can come in or rotate in cohorts and come in. We're seeing some positives, and we're seeing an instructional shift where in a lot of cases, our teachers were just not trained to be facilitators in this work, and they're learning as they go. So it's been a challenge, but we're seeing positives. We know we have a long way to go. And at the policy federal level, we deal with that as well. And I know that that'll come up later in the conversation. This is a tough fix, but it has to be done for our communities. With Dr. Lee talked about businesses going out because of the connectivity and in the pandemic. We look at broadband connectivity as an economic development issue. We look at it as a connection to all sorts of ways that we can make our community better and train our students for the future workforce. So thanks for having me, and this has been great so far.
Thank you. Thanks for shedding light on the process and what's going on and speaking about connectivity and all the different aspects in which it affects everybody. And also as we transitioned, you know, and how teachers are handling education now. As we have a lot of educators, I'm sure they can all relate to you at this moment, as far as even at the university level, not just K through 12, right? And so some people weren't really trained properly, like you said, right? And so we have a lot of work ahead of us. I would like to hear from Mr. Garrett Van Avery, who is here joining us as a middle school teacher at Taos International School. It's a K-12 bilingual international baccalaureate charter school in Taos, New Mexico. He is a graduate of our program, the Teachers Transform Media Fluency PD program, and he gained some media literacy skills to facilitate with students and his coworkers, and has become an amazing leader at his school. Currently, he's working on his master's in educational leadership and administration for the New Mexico State University, and he is also teaching from home. Welcome, Garrett. Please share with us some stories about your experience and what it's like in the trenches of a K through 12 classroom.
Well, you know, just kind of building on what you guys have already been talking about. And sorry, I was a couple of minutes late there. I didn't realize it was Eastern time. So I was like, but if you had asked me about this issue of connectivity a year ago, you know, I would not have put this like high on the list of concerns. And, you know, there's been talk of this like homework gap over the years and the digital divide and things, but it's always like seemed like one of those things that, hey, you know, we'll get to it when we get to it. But, you know, the COVID thing just totally laid bare what already existed. You know, I think it brought this sort of hyper awareness about the environments our students are coming from and what they do have and what they don't have. And yeah, I mean, like Mr. Pratt was saying, you know, we were thrown into this with no training and no, and I was one of the fortunate ones because I had just completed the training with Pamela in Albuquerque, and it couldn't have been better timed. I mean, it was a month afterwards we got thrown into this pandemic, and all of a sudden I was the expert on technology at my school, which is, like I always say, it's frightening. If I'm the expert, it's frightening. But there, I mean, we have basically had to attempt to build the infrastructure while the pandemic is here, while the crisis is here. And in the meantime, you know, you can imagine how hard that is to do. I mean, we were fortunate enough to have school computers, but they're not of the greatest quality. We had never sent them home with kids before. They're a couple of years old, and we've had huge connectivity issues. I mean, lots of our kids, I mean, here we are going into November, and we still have a good number of kids who aren't connected. You know, and we live in a rural area, you know, around Taos. It's a town, but lots of rural areas around it. And so we still have lots of kids who don't have internet. I actually just got an email today from my administrator, and this is the first thing I've seen so far where we're going to be able to purchase hotspots. The money just came out. It's the GEAR grant. I'm not really sure, GER. I just saw the email, but it's like $3,200. We're finally getting to purchase hotspots. But we have students we haven't seen since, yeah, so we haven't seen basically since March. And, you know, it's incredibly difficult to track people down, and it's incredibly difficult to get a hold of people. So, I mean, that's the biggest thing. I mean, the equity concerns are enormous. I mean, school has always had problems with equity, but before at least in the building, you know, we had an environment that was somewhat similar for most students. And now we have something that's completely dissimilar. And you can imagine the kids who do well in online learning, they're the ones who have a parent that's not working. Well, one parent makes lots of money and they're able to stay home, sit with them. They have great internet. They have a personal computer. you know, because our computers aren't great. So they have good connectivity, a good computer, and somebody there with them. And those are the kids who do well. The kids who don't have that, regardless of what their intelligence or ability level is, it doesn't seem to matter. It's that lack of support has created that situation. So we see it's not much of a meritocracy right now. It's very much people who have money are more advantaged, and people who are grappling with poverty are at a huge disadvantage, much more so than before the pandemic. And I think the biggest thing I've seen teaching is just that social emotional void that students are feeling. And I think, you know, it's been especially hard on students who, like I said, they're students who are coming from more poverty, backgrounds of poverty, and they don't necessarily have the support at home. School is able to provide them with a very structured day, food when they need it. And we're giving out food, but we, quite frankly, not everybody will come and get it. I mean, even just getting to the school to get food is a challenge. So, but that's been the biggest thing, is just trying to connect with students, and especially students who are just slipping away, and realizing, like, you know, we're going to lose, you know, we have the potential to lose a lot of students. I was speaking with a high school counselor the other day, and she was telling me that 25 out of the 170 high school seniors are on track to graduate. So, you know, we have this huge blow. And I think in Taos and in New Mexico in general, and I think in all of rural America, I mean, we just weren't prepared to transition, and we're still not making that transition. We're coming up short. I mean, things are being done and we're moving in that direction, but we're a long ways off.
Thanks, Garrett.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your experience and some of the challenges, you know, because it's good for us to understand, you know, what it looks like and at which levels, you know, and how it's impacting our students and our communities and our graduation rates, and so much more than that. So thank you for sharing. We'll talk about some solutions. I want to in a little bit, but right now I'm going to introduce Jason, Dr. Jason Schrantz. He is full-time English faculty at the, oh my gosh, I don't know how to pronounce this word, Gogebic Community College in Ironwood, Michigan, sorry, where he teaches classes in composition, contemporary literature, and popular American culture. He has participated in the Media Education Lab's programs and applies his understanding of media and digital literacy in the classroom, and is, when he's not teaching, he's wandering in the deep woods of the Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Thank you for joining us. Provide us a view into how the digital divide impacts your college students, the community college students in particular.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the word Gogebic actually is an Ojibwe word for the ripple that a trout makes when it comes up to the surface of the water. And just knowing that there's a word for that in some vernacular was reason enough to come here. Though heading into my interview a few years ago for this job, I had to practice the pronunciation so many times I was afraid I was going to lose the opportunity by not knowing how to pronounce it. Yeah, so we are in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, on the farthest western tip. There's just a tiny little portion of Michigan that's in central time zone. We're about 1,500 miles north of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where some of you are nearby. And like some of the people who have already spoke, we have very similar concerns with the digital divide. Our community college has enrollment of under 1,000 people, even though our college has been around for over 80 years. We are in a mining community that has not had any real mining activity in the last 50 years. So the population has dwindled significantly. The industry in the area has dwindled, and it's very small, and it's kind of feels sometimes like a forgotten sort of area. As far as our concerns with digital divide, infrastructure certainly is a concern. We do have a lot of people who just, it's whether it's somebody had said earlier, it's not just a matter of poverty, but it's also, let me see the note that I took. It's both poverty and infrastructure. There are people who have the means but don't live in a place where they can have access to online, learning in this case. So we had one of the decisions that our college made when the pandemic spread was we, like everybody, like most people, we went online in the spring, but the big discussion over the summer was, what are we going to do in the fall? We knew, based on trends of community colleges around Michigan, that we stood to lose something near 30% of enrollment if we were to continue going online. And this would be a college our size. This would just be a reason to shut the doors. I mean, unfortunately, it was that devastating. And so we went in person, and it's a community college schedule. So we have instructors teaching 5-6 classes or so, interacting with upwards of 100 students, unique students a week. And so there were lots of, things put into place in terms of trying to keep people safe, like distancing and masks, of course, but also trying to fit students into these really large classrooms where you can have 30 students in a classroom and be 6 feet apart. And it impacted the actual class in ways that I didn't anticipate. Some of my I went into this thinking, focused on the digital divide. I thought about it in terms of, how are my students going to access content if they have to be quarantined, if they have to, take 14 days off, or if they've been in contact with somebody with COVID. And what ended up being a larger concern, to address that, one of the things that we did was we put Zoom in. We had Zoom stations in our classrooms so that we taught in person, and then also would live stream our courses out to anybody who happened to be quarantined. And one of the problems that happened with this is when opening this door to try to provide everybody access to the classroom, revealed that, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. We had a lot of students who took advantage of this option and would come to class through Zoom. And so we might start the semester with 20 people in the classroom and 2 or 3 on Zoom. This quickly grew, this quickly shifted. So we'd end with about 2 or 3 people in the classroom and a number of people on Zoom. And so the point I'm trying to make here is the students, even in a rural community, the students had access, but what was revealed is they were undeveloped in their skills to how to manage these tools in a way that benefited them, and in a way that promoted their student learning. So for equity reasons, we wanted to make sure every student had access to attend classes remotely. No cameras required if they didn't want to do this. So sorry, I was just looking at the chat. So no cameras required to do this, but also the students. I think that there was this mindset in this in kind of the rural area, that students who they would equate being in the classroom with sort of real presence, and then you were either in the classroom or you were absent, and then this sort of remote access to the classroom was in this kind of middle area where students were doing it, I think, in some ways to check a box to make sure I was marked present, but they weren't invested in the class. They didn't have this sort of mindset that I'm here, I'm present, I'm available. They don't, they don't see each other because the students weren't using the camera. And I think that it was, sort of revealed kind of a lack of, undeveloped media skills. And I think that this is probably common in rural areas where you might have these devices and you might have some infrastructure, but they've arrived later than what they have in other communities. I used to live 3 hours from here back in 2000, I think it was 2010, in Marquette, Michigan, when there was a really big deal in the town at the time. President Obama visited our town as part of this initiative to make Wi-Fi, broadband Wi-Fi, free and available in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And this was, I'm pretty sure it was 2010 or 11, and this initiative is still in place, and they're trying to spread the access. But with the access, we also need the media literacy skills. So we do have access in a lot of the Upper Peninsula, but we don't have the skills. Our devices, our phones, our computers are often, the places where we go to socialize and where our students, often go to socialize and they use them as entertainment. They're sort of entertainment machines, and they have trouble seeing those machines as something that could be used for an educational purpose. And so just to kind of wrap up what I was thinking about in preparation for this is that right now, because the pandemic has really spiked in this area, we have just made this decision to move online. We've been online now for 2 weeks, and then yesterday we got a call that said we're staying remote until the end of the semester. The students who were attending class remotely, they had the devices, they had the infrastructure, but they chose to attend remotely before we were closed down, are the ones who have sort of fallen off from the course now. They're hard to access. They're not checking their email. And I think it doesn't have to do with infrastructure as much as it has to do with media literacy habits, media literacy just in general, using these tools in something for something other than entertainment and just social connections, as well as trying to bridge social connections with education. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason, for letting us know what's going on over there in Michigan and how the experience of your students are. We have 10 minutes before this conversation closes. I want to introduce the Honorable Lloyd Levine, and he's worked on some of those solutions, right? He was a former member of the California State Legislature, where he served as chair of the Assembly Committee on Utilities and Commerce. Currently, he serves as the president of Filament Strategies, where he provides public policy and public affairs consulting services in the technology and environmental sectors. He is working with broadband adoption and the digital divide, and has for a while. While in the legislature, through his chair, he established himself as one of the leading experts in energy, telecommunications, and technology policy. He authored numerous pieces of legislation tackling some challenging statutory policy changes, and which became national models in many national areas. So welcome, the Honorable Lloyd Levine. Please let us know, we want to hear some solutions. We want to hear about how to move forward, where California is with the digital divide. And we also want to hear some solutions from our audience and some solutions from the people that are presented here today.
Sure. By way of a little additional context for my background, I'm also a senior policy fellow at the University of California, Riverside School of Public Policy. That's okay. And have spent the last couple of years publishing academic research on this topic as well, looking at a variety of aspects of the digital divide, solutions to closing the digital divide. Lately been focusing on K-12 education, technology, COVID, and that intersection and its impact as well. So, I have a book coming out next year on some of these issues. The book is called Technology versus Government: The Irresistible Object meets the Irresistible Force meets the Immovable Object, and looks at a number of ways that government and technology interact, including how people without internet access government services in a whole host of ways. So that's just a little bit of my my personal background. So when I look at this from a policy standpoint, I want to figure out first, and when I'm advocating, I want to tell policymakers, this is the problem you are trying to solve. And I like to be very specific, and I did a bunch of research, and I have my own definition, and I call it meaningful internet access. That is the goal you are aiming for, is meaningful internet access, because providing access alone doesn't solve the problem. This is not a suitable computing device for a high school student applying to college, an unemployed person applying to work. Trying to type a resume or a term paper on this device is insufficient. So when I say meaningful internet access, it's a broadband connection that meets government's definition of minimum served speed. We had to go with some definition. I actually think in many areas, the government definition is probably a little too slow, but we went with that. A computing device capable of meeting the demands of the day. We specifically did not enumerate a type of device because technology changes like this. So the device that's suitable today might be superseded by something tomorrow. So it's whatever can meet the prevailing needs, whether it's education, workforce, et cetera. The third component that's often overlooked is digital literacy skills. Do you have the skills to do rudimentary things like typing a resume, sending an email, doing a Google search to find a job, et cetera? I think of all the things my wife and I do to support our first graders' education. If you don't have the digital, if your parent or caregiver doesn't have the digital literacy skills to provide those services, your child is going to suffer. So those are the three components to meaningful internet access. Additionally, under COVID, one thing that we've discovered as I've focused more on K-12 is there's a component that's under-accessed or under-resourced, and that is based on survey data. What we determine as served is, do you have a broadband connection and how do you connect? Do you connect with this or are you connecting with the computing device? Well, now under COVID, as everybody is working from home, under-resourced could be, yes, you have broadband and a computing device, but you have 3 people who need it and your bandwidth isn't sufficient and your device isn't sufficient. So some school districts are overcoming that challenge. Our school district distributed 25,000 computing devices back in April. So that's how it's being overcome. So that's kind of the framework I look at when I'm trying to figure out policy solutions. We're trying to get to this goal where it's not just closing the digital divide, but it's meaningful internet access. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, one thing I talk a lot about, not because I come from cities, I was born in Los Angeles, I live in Sacramento now. I love rural areas, and I know that rural connectivity is a huge problem. There have been tens of billions of dollars spent over the last decade plus to connect rural areas. The urban digital divide is overlooked and neglected. And I'm not wanting to divide rural from urban. I want both to be solved. But as you look around the country, there are about 25% of Americans, and I use 2 sources of data for my primary research, Pew and some California specific data that actually are independently collected and track very similarly, so it's a good check on each other. And we're looking at about 25% to 30% of Americans, depending upon where you live, that don't have meaningful internet access. The number shrinks if you count a cell phone, but if you use my definition, it's 25 to 30% of Americans. The vast majority of them live in urban areas, and they don't have meaningful internet access because they can't afford a device or the service. In California, for example, we have between 2 and 2.5 million households that are urban suburban that don't have meaningful internet access, while we only have about 600,000 rural households. And again, that's not to say we should neglect the rural households, but we need to focus on the urban households. And I'll skip all the reasons why and the political coalitions that can make it more appealing to focus on the urban. So that's what I look at. So here are some of the solutions that we've come up with as to how to address this. In California, in about 2008, I helped, along with former FCC and California Public Utilities Commissioner Rochelle Chong, create the California Advanced Services Fund. It is a dedicated fund on your telephone bill, cell phone bill, that funds, it's changed over the years. It was initially designed to offset the middle mile costs of deploying to rural areas. It's a very rigorous process. You can look on the CPUC website in California to find out all the details. I won't belabor it, but it's a funding source that dedicates money to closing the digital divide. Over the years, it's been expanded a little bit at my urging. It now includes some money for urban adoption issues. Not enough, but at least it's in there. We've got regional broadband consortia that are funded through there, and a few other things that go into that. And it's renewed about every 5 years legislatively. So, and we've done that at the federal level with CAF2, CAF2. We're in the middle of the RDOF process, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund right now, to do some of those sorts of things. We had the ARA funds, and I wrote a major paper a couple of months ago that looked at the lack of effectiveness, honestly, of the ARA funds on closing the urban digital divide. That was the biggest source of money we had, and it just didn't work at all. So I looked at those. So we need to what I think we need to do in the rural area is obviously spend on deployment. We need to change the way we do the deployment policies in rural areas. Right now, most of those rural areas are served when private sector decides they want to serve them. It's not a strategic target by government, particularly in California, but even through some of the other funds, the RDOF. I was actually consulting with a company to help them with their RDOF funding. And as I learned about the RDOF process, if nobody applies for the funds, the area is unserved regardless of the need. And that's similar here in California. Additionally, the internet service providers can block in California. And I'm not sure, federally, but if they intend to serve, they claim at the PUC that they intend to serve, then the funds don't go to the company that would serve it because, of competitive issues. Now, there's no obligation for those ISPs to actually serve. So you can go 5 years later and still have no service in their area, but they claim they intend to serve. So I think government needs to get the political will and be more strategic in rural areas. The other last thing I'll say on rural before I move to urban is there's a policy that we implemented here in California that we're rolling out called Dig Once. The biggest impediment to rural areas in California, and to a large degree across the country, most people think of California as the Silicon Valley and some of these others, but we have huge rural areas too. It's the middle mile deployment. It's getting from the backbone to the community. And the cost there is actually the trenching. The biggest cost is trenching mile after mile after mile to lay the fiber. So the Dig Once policy is implemented through the Public Utilities Commission and the Department of Transportation. And it really says, if you are digging up a highway for any purpose, you lay conduit. Even if nobody's going to pull through that conduit at that moment, you lay conduit. Because you can pull 100 miles of cable through conduit in a fraction of the time it's going to take you to dig that. So if you're digging, put the conduit down. When we're ready to serve, we can save a lot of time and money by pulling through the conduit. We work with the PUC to identify strategic corridors so we know we're not laying conduit where it's not needed. But where there's a strategic corridor that's being dug up, lay the conduit. The urban side is a little more challenging because it's going to involve a little more money and a little more political will. And really the issue is, the telecom companies are very innovative. But in California, the argument goes, and I've seen the argument at the federal level, we're competitive, leave us alone. And that was true. I take umbrage to that right now. In California, there are a few areas where you have a choice between 3 competitors. Most have 2 competitors, your legacy cable company and your legacy telecom company. There's plenty of areas that have 1 provider and no providers. That's an oligopoly. That's not a fully functioning competitive marketplace. It may be competitive for people like us who can afford to decide which service they want. But when it comes to poverty and lower income households, the assumption is, because they're served by formerly regulated companies like AT&T, that broadband is a regulated entity and that the low income households must be taken care of, but it's not. The providers all have voluntary low income programs, but that is a far cry from the programs that we used to have, the Lifeline for telephone service, those sorts of things. So I without trying to step on toes for telecom companies and make them non-competitive and regulated, we need to do, I believe, a quasi-regulatory effort for low-income households. So we can leave the competitive side alone, but for low-income households, and I don't think it's rocket science, the FCC started down this path, and then under the Trump, under Obama's last year, the FCC started down declaring them a Title II common carrier, giving them the authority to regulate them. President Trump rolled all that back. We'll see what happens in the next administration. One takeaway from here is all of us could and should lobby the new new FCC to declare the information service as a Title II common carrier and really focus on not regulating them. I don't believe in regulating innovation for the sake of regulating. That's not necessary. But it's been clear to me from the papers I've published and the data that I have looked at that the competitive marketplace, and I guess I should add this, and I usually do this with a graph over my shoulder. If you look, what's that?
We're pretty much out of time.
I'll finish up right now, sorry. The digital divide, the broadband was deployed initially in residential households in 2000 to 2001. By 2010, the graph went to 70%, and since 2010, it's flatlined. The competitive marketplace isn't working, so we need to come up with new solutions through the federal government to provide a broadband to low-income households and assure they can afford it and maintain their access, that they don't sign up, drop off, sign up, drop off. There you go. Sorry if I took a little too long.
Thank you. Well, it's a complex issue. There are so many different ways of looking at the digital divide, and really we could spend a whole day speaking about the digital divide. You're welcome to stay on if we want to talk about a few solutions, and I'm just going to keep the recording going. But I know if you have to leave, if people have to leave, then I just thank you for joining us. And we'll just keep having the discussion here for a few more minutes on some other solutions that that we can do in our classrooms and legislatively, and there are many approaches to this issue, and so thank you again, and thank you for explaining all these things, which we can take back to our communities. Whether you're an advocate or whether you're not an advocate, you can advocate if you like, because it's an issue that is affecting all of our communities and every level, our families, our neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it was incredibly enlightening. Garrett, I would like to hear about some of the things you said you were doing in your classroom to address as a solution to those kids that are not showing up for class. Are you still here with us, Garrett?
Yeah, no, I'm here. So one of the issues is the access, right? Some kids just don't have access and have no way of easily getting that access. Like you said, the lines aren't trenched and so they need a hotspot, and that's we've been trying to get the money. But in terms of just getting kids in general, it's like attendance is down. So I've tried different strategies. One thing, I'll pick up the phone and just call everybody and figure out where they're at. I mean, when we start class, and it's again, back to the equity thing. It's great for some kids. Online learning has been incredible for some students, and it's just not equitable for everybody. So some kids are getting a whole lot out of it, and some kids are just getting left behind. So yeah, calling people, just constantly on them, trying to make it as engaging as possible. I mean, we've had to adjust workloads and things like that. We have multiple teachers teaching. So just, and really thinking about, I was talking with another teacher the other day about a student, and it's like thinking about, we call the soft skills, right? But remembering, like, we need to keep these kids because we're going to have learning loss. I mean, that's just a fact. And people talk about learning loss, and it's like, but if you're a motivated learner, I think, and you feel you can make up a lot of that. But if you've completely checked out, dropped out, lost all motivation, have given up, you're never going to recover from that. So really thinking about what the bigger prize is here in terms of, like, what do we need to guard the most? And I think it's those relationships, and they're difficult to maintain over online, but I could give you more, but I know we're low on time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So Dr. Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, if I want
We
to
would
just
love to
add
hear from
something,
you.
and thank you. And I really appreciated everybody's comments. In particular, I appreciated the comments from Garrett and Jason, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I think the learning loss is real. A McKinsey study basically suggested that African-American kids will be behind 10.3 months if they're not connected to learning. Latina kids more than that, and low-income kids about a year. And so if we thought we were fighting a Brown versus Board of Education, almost a few decades ago, we're going to fight it again because kids do not have the resources that they need. But I want to pay attention to a comment that Jason made that I also thought about the other day on a panel. I mean, I have a 14-year-old upstairs and learning. I don't know what she's doing because I'm down here. Other day I went upstairs, she was laying on the floor. So I don't know what's going on up there. And I've had to catch myself. But Jason made this comment, though, about where there are some opportunities that I think are really important to capture, which is teaching kids this new media literacy. What does it mean? I mean, look at all of us on these Zooms. Look at what the world is going to look like when we go back to work, quote unquote. How is it that we're taking these lessons? And I've had the opportunity, like Lloyd, to talk to superintendents across the whole entire country. I'm working on a project now that's evaluating 3 of these cities. But the key thing is, like, how are we translating what kids are going through into lessons for the future of industry? A future of industry that will be disaggregated, that will be more remote. I mean, think about it. The companies that are coming back are not coming back in brick and mortar. They're coming back in digital. And so what does that look like? And are we capturing that intentionally in terms of the type of note-taking skills and the attentiveness with students? I also think for a teacher, what Garrett said, then we're thinking about what does truancy and discipline look like for kids? You're not the only school where kids are missing. Los Angeles County had thousands of kids, about 15,000 kids that went off the books because they didn't check in. They became known as virtual truants. What does that mean for kids that we've invested all this time within school systems to ensure that we're not disparately approaching discipline in very unfair ways? How does that look in terms of the mental health? My daughter grabbed me one day, just started crying. I think the mental health concerns are real. And these kids are not just going through mental health in COVID, they're going through mental health with George Floyd and a whole host of other issues that are affecting them. And I think the third thing that's most important, and this is sort of what Lloyd said, is how does this match up with the expectations that Washington is actually putting out there in terms of policy? And where's the disconnect in terms of the type of universal service? There are thousands of school districts who will be under duress when the CARES Act funding that paid for hotspots expires on 12/31. So who is at the table sustaining this? We're doing a panel at Brookings on Monday, 1 o'clock, with the president of the MacArthur Foundation, the superintendent of the Reynolds Oregon School District, mayor of Newport News, Virginia, as well as my colleague John Vallant, who's talking about school reopening from the Brown Center, which is our educational policy center. There are going to be correlations between digital and achievement gaps. And so I had to share that because, I'm just one person. I run around the country. I'm a parent. I know what's happening. I see how it's affecting me, but it is so authentic to hear it from individuals that are out there trying to figure this out. And anecdotally, I had the superintendent of schools on a podcast that we have, Tech Tank. He made a question. He said, Nicole, there are parents using our kids' Google Chromebooks to log in for work. And we've had to be okay with that because they don't have any other options because of poverty. So I'm really, really encouraged, and thank you for having me on this. And I hope to follow up with a couple of you because I think it's going to be these stories that are going to humanize situation. But I want to say to all of you, the teachers are heroes right now because they're doing the impossible in reimagining education during a time period where we can't even reimagine healthcare and public health and what that looks like. And so you are just as important as any essential worker because you are charged with making sure our kids, because if our kids get left behind, our industries are going to be left behind. And there will be nobody to work in 10 years. And so I think we're not getting that all of this matters. So I am so humble to be on this panel with all of you and hope to just stay in touch.
So when I was listening to what was just being said by Dr. Lee, it reminded me of one thing that I also discovered that we didn't consider before in regard to teachers is that's half the equation now with the digital divide is we've got teachers who don't have sufficient digital literacy skills. My fourth grade daughter's teacher spent several hours a day with me on the phone trying to figure out how to get his stuff to work. As an aside, he lives in a more rural area. He has one provider, not great. And he also had to cancel school earlier this year because a pony he owns got out and was roaming the neighborhood, which I just thought was like the best epitome of distance learning in 2020. But one of the things I call for in the paper that I saw, Pamela, that you shared is school districts should focus on the teachers as well and make sure the teachers have the ability to deliver it. I like to use sports metaphors, and I like to say it doesn't matter if Jerry Rice is the receiver. If I'm the quarterback, he ain't catching the pass because I can't throw it that far. So if your teacher can't deliver instructional materials because they don't know how or they don't have the technology, it doesn't matter if your kid's a straight A student. So that's a component that we should focus on as well.
Wonderful. So listen, I just want to, Pam, I just want to say we have to close this session down because we're starting another session now, but really grateful for everybody who participated. We'll give them a round of applause. Thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for everybody.
Wonderful.
All right, thank you. Till next time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Have a good one, guys.